Before we begin, the queer portfolio of the Melbourne University Law Students Society and the Indigenous Law and Justice Hub acknowledge that the law school sits on stolen Wiradjuri land of the Kulin Nation. I would like to pay my respects to the elders both past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here this evening. We celebrate the outstanding contributions of local providers of the queer community like Kalarie Pride Victoria, Out Black, and Strong Brother Strong Sister, alongside the work of nationwide organisations Black Rainbow and First Nations Rainbow. Together, these groups work tirelessly to support, elevate, and advocate for the rights of the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander queer community. Together, we hope to learn from these leading organisations and continue building a safer space for all. Hello everyone, welcome to the annual Queer Lecture presented by the Queer Portfolio of the Law Students Society in collaboration with the Indigenous Law and Justice Hub. My name is Mother and I'm the Queer Director of the Melbourne University Law Students Society. Alongside my queer officers Vina and Emily, I'll be one of your hosts for this evening. Before I introduce our esteemed guest and speaker, who I'm sure you're all eager to hear from, I'd just like to extend my thanks to a few key people. Firstly, I'd like to thank Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, Anne Genovese, Interim Dean Professor Alison Duxbury, and the team at the Hub for your support in bringing this lecture to life. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Todd Fernando. Todd is a key figure in advancing social justice and policy in Australia. He's a descendant of the Kalarie peoples of the Wiradjuri Nation, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Holding a PhD in medical anthropology, his research examines the experiences of LGBTQIA+ individuals within Australian healthcare settings, with a special focus on the unique contributions of queer Indigenous perspectives to healing practices and research methodologies. As the former Commissioner for Victoria's LGBTIQ+ communities, Todd provided crucial advice to the Victorian Government on the development of policies, services, and programs that are inclusive and meet the needs of our diverse communities. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Todd Fernando to present his lecture, Culture, Colonies, and Camp, Indigenous Rights Across the Pacific.
Can I start by acknowledging that no matter where we are in Australia, we walk on Aboriginal land, and I want to pay my respects to ancestors past, present, and emerging. Can I also start by thanking the organisers of this event, Math and others who have tirelessly put on, I think, what has been a very important conversation at the Melbourne Law School, conversations that have too often, I think, happened on the margins in the peripherals of elevator conversations or around the quiet corners of the Melbourne Law School library, trying to hide from others trying to come in. And I think that in and of itself, the exclusion of others who are outside the law school and their identities in and around how they interact, I think forms an interesting lens to view and understand the way in which the conversations happen inside this place. And so I want to congratulate them on quite a stark journey from Justice Kirby to Todd Fernando in just 1 year. We couldn't be two different people. I am not Justice Kirby, though it must be nice to be a white man of his calibre. I've been exploring and interested in understanding queerness across the Pacific and across the world for a very, very long time. I'm also obviously interested in understanding that from an Indigenous perspective, from a First Nations perspective, and understand kind of what that looks like. So in addressing, I guess, the complexity of this intersection, indigeneity, colonialism, and queerness, I think we're going to we're going to look at the often overlooked nexus of those identities and the historical legacies that have marked the way in which these communities have emerged. For Indigenous people across the Pacific, the impacts of colonialism has been far-reaching, not only in terms of land dispossession, cultural disruption, and political marginalisation, but also in ways that colonial powers sought to regulate and suppress expressions of gender and of sexuality. The imposition of Western norms around heteronormativity and binary gender systems disrupted Indigenous understandings of identity, where many communities held more fluid, non-binary or inclusive ways of viewing gender and sexuality prior to colonisation. The importance of understanding this intersection lies in recognising that for many queer Indigenous people, our experience of marginalisation is often shaped by multiple interlocking forms of oppression. Colonialism obviously is not just a historical backdrop. It continues to inform the legal and social and cultural realities faced by many queer Indigenous people today, and of course, many communities across Australia and the world. By exploring this intersection, we, I think tonight, will attempt to gain a deeper understanding of how colonial era laws continue to perpetuate discrimination and how queer Indigenous people are reclaiming their cultural identities and resisting these oppressive legacies. This intersectional lens, I think, is crucial because it illuminates how decolonisation must involve not just the reclamation of land, but sovereignty and the recovery and validation of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and loving, rather than doing. As we trace these intricate connections, I'm going to ask that we reimagine a future where queer Indigenous rights are not seen as add-on to legislative frameworks or conversations within broader struggles for justice, but are understood as the integral part of decolonisation of both land and identity. So, the Pacific region is an expansive and culturally rich area, home to a vast array of communities spread across thousands of islands. It encompasses diverse nations from Polynesia to Melanesia to Micronesia, each with its own unique languages, traditions, and social structures. The region's rich diversity also extends to its legal systems, its colonial histories, as many of Pacific nations across this region were colonised by European powers, including the British, French, Dutch, and Spanish, who imposed their governance, their religion, and their legal frameworks. Now, while New Zealand and Australia have shared histories of British colonisation and have made notable progress in terms of LGBTIQ+ rights, many communities across the Pacific, including Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, for example, continue to grapple with the legacies of their colonial past. Colonial powers imposed law and legal systems that criminalised homosexuality, restricted gender identities and expression, and undermined Indigenous social orders, leaving enduring impacts that continue to shape laws and attitudes in society. So the Pacific is a region of contrasts in my mind. It's a place of deep cultural richness and resilience, but one where its colonial legacies and its conservative past, particularly in relation to LGBTIQ+ people, continues to be a feature of current day politics. So understanding the Pacific requires an appreciation of its cultural, of its diversity and the ongoing struggles for decolonisation, legal reform, and its cultural reclamation. At the heart of this discussion tonight is the legacies of colonialism, an inheritance that many Pacific nations never asked for, but were left with nonetheless. And I want to remind us here, colonial legacies, they don't just claim the land, but it's often a lie sold to us. It's about the bodies on those lands and how those bodies operate, whether within love, within hunting, within ritual. These laws, however, don't disappear when the colonisers pack their bags and go. They remain deeply, deeply embedded. I think that's going to get to the heart of what it is that we're here to talk about tonight. I know many in the room are kind of looking at me being like, yeah, we kind of get this. We're sold. We're on that part of the choir. But there's a deeper part of the conversation, I think, that might make you think a little bit differently in regards to resistance and in regards to decolonisation. Places like Fiji and Papua New Guinea and Samoa continue to uphold restrictive laws, even when they make no sense in modern worlds. They serve as legal ghosts of a violent past, imposing a kind of straitjacket, if you will, on societies that were in fact much more fluid and open than these laws ever acknowledged. Yet the narrative of the Pacific isn't one of passive endurance. It's one of active defiance. Across the region, we're seeing a shift in the landscape around LGBTIQA+ rights. And look, it's not perfect. As somebody who's just finished a tenure with the Victorian Government, it will never be perfect. But nonetheless, it's critically important to do so. Countries like Australia and New Zealand, which I'll largely leave out of this conversation, partly because we're in it, we kind of get it. There will be moments where I'll touch on it, but for the most part, it will be around countries in the Pacific. What emerges so powerfully for me when I look at these communities across the Pacific is its richness in understanding their cultural histories. But it's marked by this really complex juxtaposition between upholding colonial legacy. And that's what I really want to get into tonight, because it's these colonial legacies, these oppressive laws that slow and even march towards the rights and powerful surgence of Indigenous resistance. So I want to also do this in regards to an assemblage theory. People understand what assemblage theory is. Anyone want to have a go at attempting it? John, do you want to have a go? So assemblage theory posits that we can build the kind of fabric of social life and order by placing things on top of each other. So I, as a gay Aboriginal man, you get it. Right, gotcha. So this is how we're going to imagine this conversation in this lecture tonight, by understanding the place in which these people that I'm talking about, which aren't foreign from us, that they're our neighbours and have been for a very, very long time, have different imaginations around the legal systems that are being imposed or that are being transformed in order to give greater rights to those in the region. Assemblage theory forces us, I think, to see colonisation, culture and queerness as constantly in motion, shifting and influencing each other. And so for me, it's not just a picture of domination versus resistance. There has to be both. And I think that's a really interesting site and a place to sit with, that domination requires resistance. Resistance requires a domination. And so it's this that I think we'll also tussle with through this lecture. Through this lens, I want to understand a better kind of framework for understanding what queer Indigenous means in the context of queer Indigenous. Queer Indigenous aren't queer or Indigenous or queer Indigenous words. They are also words that are imposed upon groups of people across the world. Many of us consider these to be a Western framework of understanding queerness or a Western framework for understanding Indigenous people. So it becomes a bit complicated when we talk about queer Indigenous, even though those words don't really hold meaning for many of those communities. So people know what Indigenous queer words are or identities across the Pacific. Does anybody want to shout something out? Have a go. Takatapui from New Zealand. Whakawhene from Samoa. We've got two. Two out of the many thousands of communities that exist across the region that is so vast. Colonialism is working. It's still here. We, as people who are largely educated, prestigious Melbourne Law School, have, I just my words carefully here, slightly become uneducated on those in the region in which we're meant to serve. How do we think about legal frameworks and justice about people who have been marginalised when we can't even name them? I think the European colonial powers that arrived in the Pacific brought with them, obviously, their guns and their missionaries and trade, but a legal framework that fundamentally opposes Indigenous norms. Not people, but norms. And there's a good distinction to make between that. The British, French, Dutch, Spanish imposed a legal system that regulated the life and the aspect of life in the colonies, including gender, sexuality, and the body. So these legal systems were not only an extension of European sovereignty over Indigenous lands, but as a tool to control and suppress Indigenous identity, particularly through criminalisation of their practices, whether that be just being or just trying to love. We criminalised it. So the most prominent example of the British Empire's reliance on this form of regulation was the Offences Against the Persons Act of 1861, which introduced the criminalisation of unnatural offences across its colonies. But we know Justice Blackstone's work earlier precedes this in and around buggery and the use of such terms in order to control and regulate people that the European powers, particularly British, were trying to do. So when they planted the flag in Australia, for example, in 1788, it became illegal for anybody in Australia, so any Aboriginal person at 1788, to be gay. Despite 60,000 years of things that were happening, on day one of planting the flag, not only was the land taken, but the right to love someone in the way that you wanted to express that love was imposed upon you. Obviously, this imposition isn't walking around being like, you're gay, you're out. It doesn't happen like that. We know that laws often influence the way that societies and cultures and mores will interact with each other. So this law was meant to provide a justification in which the perversive nature, the savagery became illuminated within public. So the legal systems, the law along with earlier statutes criminalised consensual same-sex relations under broad terms like buggery or gross indecency. Gross indecency is such a good term. There's another term, a friend of mine said, I'm professionally offended. And I'm like, oh, I am so using that. I'm professionally offended by these terms. So this imposition was not just about regulating behaviour. It was about a colonial strategy for domination, rooted often in Victorian-era Christian values that conflated sexuality with morality and public order. In French colonies, the Neapolitan Code, or the Code Penal, initially decriminalised same-sex relations between consenting adults, but imposed strict public morality laws that enforced heteronormative behaviour and gender conformity. This would have gotten me killed a long time ago. But in practice, colonial administration in French Pacific territories often imposed severe social controls, further criminalising public expressions of non-heteronormative behaviour through local ordinances, and here's the kicker, religious policies. In both legal traditions, Indigenous norms around gender and sexuality were systematically dismantled, with European authorities seeking to reshape local laws to reflect their own societal values. Indigenous Pacific societies, which often recognise fluidity in their gender, found that their systems of customary laws were slowly being eroded. At the same time, Western customary laws on sexuality were exploding and being evolving. This dichotomy, strange in my mind, that over the last 200 years, particularly in an Australian context, queer Indigenous almost is erased, while queerness in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, sexy, amazing. Woo! This is about the way in which society functions and your place in society. If your place in society is at the centre, of course your sexuality is going to be bold and audacious and you go girl. But if you're Indigenous, First Nations, migrant, refugee, religious, it becomes a little bit more complex, a little bit more misunderstood. I think what we will find in exploring legal codes across the Pacific will represent a kind of radical shift in the relationship between state power and the individual, particularly in the Pacific. Now, I want to couch that again because this term individual really has no place within Indigenous communities. We know that communities are families and kinship structures and are structured as so. So the idea of the individual and their relationship to the state power is really, really complex. So, examples like sodomy law impose British legal codes, criminalise these acts as state-sanctioned systems of surveillance and punishment. Somebody tell me what that means? What do you think that means? It's going to be an interactive lecture. How do you impose punishment in regards to sexuality? Arthur Cook once said that anybody found in using buggery should be sent on a boat to New Zealand where he shall be eaten by the natives. Guys get a free trip to New Zealand. Woo. Why is removing the object from purview important in terms of criminality and punishment?
So the sickness doesn't spread.
Oh, sickness doesn't spread like that. You were doing great in the 80s.
Hiding it and making it invisible so we didn't see it.
Yeah. Can't be real. That's such a phase. Because I don't know any gay people, says Bob Carter. What else? Why might removing it be the option of punishment? You're not normal. There's nobody like you around here, is essentially what these laws and what punishment is trying to create. It's social and cultural order, sanctioned by the state. And this becomes really complex for people who have never positioned themselves in a relationship with what that means if the state is not attacking you. It's hard for people to conflate the notion of empathy when it comes to the notion that the state is trying to get rid of you. They're trying to erase me. I often hear in marches on the streets in Melbourne. But people don't understand what that context means in relationship to history, in relationship to current state political powers, and the suppression of identities when it comes to legislative frameworks, where if you're not named as such, you're erased. And that's a really interesting and complex approach to legislative justice. Right now, tomorrow, we're about to submit I've just been on a rapid review of domestic sexual family violence approaches in Australia. And me and the 5 other co-panelists are frantically texting each other, being like, what about the monks or the vegans? Or we're trying to censor ourselves, we're trying to make sure everyone is included. But in doing so, we're forgetting the primal position of this is to understand the complexity of the nature. And I think that's too extreme of an example around how frameworks and responses happen. But nonetheless, it gives, I think, an interesting exploration into the heart of what it is that we're trying to get at in terms of conversations on legal precedent and sexuality. So, religion takes a really interesting place here as well. So, colonial powers rationalised that these laws, as part of their broader civilising missions, were framed as a way for European legal norms to correct what they viewed as moral failings of Indigenous societies. You didn't disappear, you're ugly people. That's a moral failing on you. You didn't disappear, you're gays. You didn't disappear, you're lesbians. That's a moral failing on you as a society, therefore barbaric, therefore savage. The act of disappearing becomes so interesting within this topic because it's literally the punishment and the control. Right now, we're seeing an incredible rise in missing Indigenous women and children from around the world. We have been watching for a very long time queer and trans people, particularly trans women, become missing and murdered. It's the disappearing, Alon often says, that hurts the most. Because when we disappear and nobody speaks up, we're never to be found. And so if we're disappeared in legal frameworks as a way to make sure that everybody feels included, I think we often miss the point around what public morality and order are opposed to justifying, which is giving little regard for the social and cultural consequences of Indigenous people who just want to love and live on the lands that they've lived on. It's a very simple notion. But the persistence of colonial laws, I think, well into the modern era speaks to its power to be sustainable. Despite the formal end of colonial rule, where many Pacific nations can continue to maintain colonial era laws that criminalise same-sex relationships and reinforce these rigid gender roles, these laws have to be put into context in which they've been embedded both as post-colonial legal frameworks, but have created a direct legacy of colonialism in the culture and the society today. So let's go through a few examples. So we've got the section 377 of the Fiji Penal Code, which has similar laws in Papua New Guinea and Samoa, which criminalises same-sex sexual behaviour or activity, which draws direct influence from the British colonial statutes. While some Pacific nations have made moves toward decriminalisation and legal frameworks and reform, others have remained deeply resistant to it. And that's an interesting idea, that people have resisted the resistance, and we'll get into that later. The legal frameworks imposed by colonial powers are upheld by contemporary political and religious elites who continue to use these laws to control social behaviour and to often suppress LGBTIQ plus rights, or the appearance of LGBTIQ plus people. They flags everywhere. Everywhere I turn, there's a pride flag, and you can thank me for it. These laws have been, I think, are the entrenchment of conservative religious values, which were introduced a long time ago through the missionary activity, which I think now act as obstacles to reform. I'm not suggesting that we get rid of religion completely, but the way in which somebody is allowed or not allowed to love somebody else, I think goes against most general frameworks about what religion is meant to do. Love thy neighbour, care for thy community, etc. But seeing these as obstacles is really interesting, because when we trace the legal history, we see that colonial powers did this to maintain an order that reshaped Indigenous legal systems and imposed the new norms. So after formal independence, Pacific nations have often struggled to extricate themselves from the deeply embedded colonial legacy and legal system that were imposed upon them. And so the far more reaching relics, I think, of the past is that these laws have evolved to function as agents of moral and legal control, aligning with often nationalist and religious narratives that many nations in the Pacific have adopted in their post-colonial state-building processes. So in countries like Fiji, New Guinea, or Samoa, colonial era laws are not just the remnants of the past, but are living and breathing elements of contemporary legal frameworks. So Fiji, for example, initially inherited its anti-sodomy laws from the British Empire. And though Fiji repealed that law in 2010, the long-standing legal culture that pathologized homosexuality remains very difficult to dismantle. In Papua New Guinea, despite achieving independence in 1975, colonial sodomy era laws still perpetuate social cultural norms. But here in New Guinea, though, the criminalisation serves as a mechanism of control, especially in rural areas where local customs often defy or defers to colonial era legal codes as sources of order and morality. Go away, we don't want to see you. We don't want to hear you. You don't exist. The law says you don't exist, therefore you don't exist. It's written there on this document. Do I see it? So, Samoa, despite its getting shift from German and latest New Zealand rule to independence from '62, the Modern Crimes Act in 2013 enshrines colonial ideas by criminalising male sexual acts with penalties of up to 7 years imprisonment. Here, the colonial laws have not been swept away by post-colonial reform, but have been reconstituted with a localised framework that blends colonial legal control with Samoan Christian values. What does resistance look like in this setting? Here in these countries, you have deeply, deeply entwined religious cultures who still are, who, by the way, we're not even getting to the fact that they've had long-standing sexual and gender expressions prior to the invasion of these cultures and these ideas, yet somehow we're still upholding them in these countries. Why is that, do you think? Beyond the social order and the control. You read my mind. Theory, of course, but I think we're onto something. That the notion that we have to go back to something that we've not fully understood because of the histories of generations being told no. I think the challenge for many of us in societies, whether we be in Indigenous ones or not, is to understand what it means to renegotiate an understanding of culture where there's been a disruption. And I think what we're seeing play out across the Pacific is communities who are resisting through disruption, who are saying, hang on, how do we uphold these Christian values when they've only been around for the last couple of 100 years? Remember Anthony Mundine's tweet? Maybe these people have, young people, old ones who are in Redford now on ABC. And in season 2, episode 3, it was a episode that focused on gay love relationships within Aboriginal Australia. And in this episode, a gay Aboriginal man comes home and brings a partner home, but his child is asleep upstairs. Nothing untoward's happened. Very consensual, very loving. You know, it was a great kind of film of it. Anthony Mundine, for those who probably have no idea, ex-NRL football player in Aboriginal in Australia turned boxer, failed boxer, I'll add that, but said in I think it was a Facebook comment or whatever it was, Adam and Eve weren't part of our stories. I'm like, Adam and Eve was in the Dream Tribe? What tribe Adam and Eve from? Because that story is only 1788 in Australia, yet somehow has undone, his notion of it anyways, is that religion has undone the last 60,000 years. And we know that there is a relationship between religious entities and the state, despite many claiming there's separation. Here, I think Mundine explores this notion of punishment and control. How dare we watch something so perverse on TV, on the ABC of all places? A gay Aboriginal man wanting to find love. That didn't exist across the last 60,000 years. Of course it didn't. Because when men go out hunting with no women for a long time, nothing happens. Let me tell you. Nothing. Women are like, woo, they're gone. But these things are so interesting when it comes to the application of law and the idea then of justice. Because if we're not reconciling both the application and the notion of justice in the complexity as I've just explained, then where do we go with this information? So these colonial laws are obviously embedded into the fabric of post-colonial legal systems, but I think are part of a deeper entanglement between identity formation and legacy. So the retention of colonial laws criminalising homosexuality in places like Papua New Guinea, Samoa and Fiji demonstrate how these laws have become tools for asserting a national identity in post-colonial countries. Rather than being discarded as colonial impositions, these laws have been reframed as protectors of morality and cultural integrity. That's lovely, isn't it? So nice. Your cultural integrity. But they are reinforced, and this is the important part, reinforced by powerful influences of religious bodies which were introduced by colonial missionaries. And so that relationship between missionary sexuality and identity, particularly around native status, becomes even a bigger intersection in which to explore all of the things that are happening there. In this sense, the legal frameworks inherited from these colonial rulers have been reconstituted with Pacific nationalism. They serve as a means of asserting independence, cultural sovereignty, even as they perpetuate the colonial ideologies. This paradox, I think, is, or the use of colonial laws to defend post-colonial identity reveals a complex way in which legal systems can be both instruments of colonial control, but symbols of national self-determination. Now that's interesting. Eddie, how many gays you got in your self-determined community up in Lower King Country? How many gays in Hong Kong? China? Taiwan? Taiwan. Yeah. So we're here, I think, at this intersection where we're starting to understand the legacies of building nations across the Pacific and across regions throughout the world, not based on, but influenced by religious values. And I think when we start to unpack this a little bit more, we see that these symbols of national self-determination become really fixated on the idea of the lie being sold to them. Clean up the streets. Get rid of the gays. Get rid of anybody who's not willing to participate in what we have determined as normal. We've shunned them and shamed them. In Samoa, for instance, the Crimes Act retention of criminal penalties for same-sex relation is often justified by appeals to Christian morality, which is seen as synonymous with Samoan identity. However, this conflation obscures the fact that these legal frameworks are not indigenous, but the products of colonial rule. Similarly, in Papua New Guinea, colonial-era sodomy laws have been integrated into legal cultures that view these provisions as central to maintaining social order, even as they marginalise and criminalise LGBTIQ+ people. The endurance of colonial laws in the Pacific is a reflection of how these structures have been internalised within all of us in post-colonial identity formation. Laws that criminalise homosexuality enforce these rigid roles, and they have remained deeply embedded in the legal and cultural landscapes of many communities across the world, but most certainly in the Pacific. And they even assert them, even with their independence. Efforts to reform these laws, whether through legal decriminalisation or broader societal shifts, face significant challenges due to the intersection of colonial legacy, nationalist identity, and religious morality. By conforming to colonial origins, these laws and detangling them from post-colonial nationalist narratives, Pacific nations must begin to move toward, I think, a legal system that genuinely reflects Indigenous ways of being, doing, and knowing. I think for too long, Pacific nations have clamoured to this notion that only the colonial era will save us. Despite thousands of years of existing, we've been sold the lie. You're a savage without these laws. Clean up your street. Get rid of the gays. I keep repeating this because that's what's happening. Efforts to reform in recent years in New Zealand and Australia, I think we've made significant strides. I think we're one of the greater ones across the Pacific, so we could be doing better. There is still only exists one commissioner for LGBTIQ communities in Australia, and that happens to be here in Victoria. We didn't get what we were promised in terms of legal reforms at a national level on with this new government, despite many of us forgetting the deal that was done. We gave up marriage equality, we got marriage equality and gave up rights to children and teachers in religious schools. That was the deal. And we forgot about that deal when we pushed and we won the marriage equality in Australia and across in New Zealand. And now we're on to the other one. We're like, oh, hang on, you're back tracking on the deal. And so it's become a really interesting conversation, I think, within communities around what that means to have a deal where it's okay for teachers and students to be discriminated within religious schools, but we got marriage equality. Meanwhile, every migrant and community member, every First Nations member is like, I don't care about marriage. And so here we see an interesting side of resistance, where for me, I couldn't care less. It is not high on my radar as an Indigenous person to become married. It's important, of course. But resisting colonial power has to be upheld by the cultural values of those in communities in which it serves. So for LGBTIQ people or queer Indigenous people across the Pacific, where marriage equality, where Amnesty International came running in and said, marriage equality, we don't care. So the conversation moves from reform around decriminalisation of practices to a conversation around accepting cultural norms as the framework in which legal resistance becomes the norm. What do I mean by that? Where do we see that in practice? Where we've borne our history in terms of colonial legacy, and we've marched full on ahead towards understanding the cultural norms that have happened in societies. Great, I'm not the only one. There are some examples though. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I want to couch this part of the lecture into, I guess, the legislative achievements that reflect the societal shifts from recognising LGBTIQ+ people, with both countries positioning themselves as religious leaders in promoting legal equality for LGBTIQ+ people. So we've got New Zealand, so Māori concepts of gender and sexuality is often differs significantly from Western norms. So traditional Māori culture recognises the fluidity of gender roles and same-sex relationships were not necessarily stigmatised before the imposition of colonial law. And the challenge in New Zealand today is to how to reconcile with both of that. Challenge in Australia, of course, is how to reconcile sister girls and brother boys, to reconcile our First Nations understandings of queerness within frameworks like marriage equality. And that's, I think, a really interesting side. In marriage equality debates that happened in Australia, where First Nations people were overwhelmingly coming out in force of it, to support it, we see an interesting rejection of what it is that they needed to do as a community to what it is that was good for the greater community. So we see this also happening in civil rights movements in America, where Black women took a step back and were asked by Black men, just hold off on your feminist stuff, just for now. Just carry that baggage a little bit more. We've got a whole thing happening here, don't muck it up for us. Clean the streets, hide the gays, hide women. We see this pattern emerging around control and order, punishment, and society. It's not new. People often think that colonialism as an event, not a structure, is a thing. It's not strategic, but it is very strategic. You can't colonize entire regions of the world without knowing exactly what it is that you're doing. In Australia, obviously, we were colonized since 1788. In America, for example, they have an extra 200 years of colonialism on top of us. People forget this. That England had 200 years of practice before they got here. They knew everything that they were about to do. They don't get here and be like, oh, I don't know, I play this land. They know exactly the technique because they've perfected it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Colonial forces have. So we get really upset, I think, in Western countries, particularly from the left, where we're trying to change these laws. But we ourselves, I think, need to do a disservice to ourselves for not recognizing that we're trying to do this within a generation where they've had hundreds of years to perfect the techniques that we're trying to dismantle. It will be almost impossible to do it and change the legal frameworks that need to be changed within a single generation. Why? It's not the legal frameworks we're trying to change. That can be done with a pen. It's the social order. It's the rejection of cleaning the streets, hiding the gays, hiding the women. That is community power that will take a very, very long time. In the Pacific region, it's manifested in quite an interesting way. So there have been criticisms to decolonisation, which should, I think, feature maybe in a future entire lecture on its own, because I think it's an interesting legal concept that has been kind of taken over in the same way that defund the police has. It's a scary term. We don't really understand it, but really it's just exercising equity in a different way. I think what the Pacific does for us is it gives us an understanding of the limitations of Western frameworks, where movements in New Zealand or Australia are, while they're grounded in Western legal and political traditions, it is at odds with the Indigenous people that they're trying to serve. We know that. We know that there's not going to be a large swathe of Indigenous specific laws or customary practices that is going to be imbued upon the entire population. It's just not. We know that's not going to happen for Pride, despite there being a rainbow flag on every corner sometimes. And I think this is the example for us to understand around how recognition of laws happens in the customs and control, the cultures of social people, us being social people. So the persistence in this way, I think. So I'm jumping ahead here. So the resistance in this way, particularly in the Pacific, becomes a really interesting site for inquiry. So the Methodist Church in Fiji, which has historically been aligned with British colonial governance, has played a crucial role in embedding those values into Fijian society today. Over time, the church became one of the most influential religious institutions in Fiji, obviously, and it acted as the moral arbiter and compass in political and social matters. Even after the formal end of colonial rule, the Methodist Church maintained significant power, reinforcing colonial-era legal frameworks that criminalised same-sex relationships as part of a broader narrative of moral purity and cultural preservation. What are we trying to preserve? What's the moral imperative here? When we say, as queer people, or as trans people, or gender diverse people, or Indigenous people, you aren't allowed to have your own law that is imposed on everybody else.
Trying to conserve the colonial infrastructure, which is like the basis of society.
So even in the act of resistance, we are recognizing that we don't want to give up what has been afforded to us. So gays might dress less gay. Women might less women. I know you know what that means. In order for purity, social cohesion. Free the Nipple campaign was wild. Blackfellas in Australia have been doing that for thousands of years. I don't get it. And so there's a complexity here between what it is that we understand between history and modernity when it comes to resistance. Because when white women freed the nipple, went wild. But for black women, savagery and barbaric. Cleaning the streets, hiding the gays, hiding women will always show up when you go looking for it. How long do I have left? I'm going to roll here. Somebody will give me a timer at some point, I'm sure. I think there also is at a state level, the reclamation of queer Indigenous identities, it often faces significant political and legal resistance in countries like Papua New Guinea, Samoa, and Fiji, where criminalising homosexuality is still on the books. In New Guinea, for example, the continued criminalisation of same-sex relationship is justified by the state as a defence of national sovereignty and cultural values, even though the laws themselves were imposed by colonial authorities. Packed up and gone. But the culture still remains. I was just recently in the Torres Strait, where they firmly believe that they practice a thing called coming of the light, which is when the missionaries arrived. They believe in their heart of hearts that it's what saved the Torres Strait Island culture from being eroded. They will never, I think, remove that cultural custom from that community because it's ingrained deeply in their societies. I wonder why we see such a high suicide rate in those communities when it comes to queer or trans people. Why they're not frequently around the islands. Or disappeared, clean the streets, hard days. Where cultures submit to colonial authorities, customs, love, expression are often the first to go. My grandfather, who grew up on the cotton farms of northern New South Wales, wasn't allowed to grandparent or parent his kids. This is what men did back then. So he parented in hiding, gave us little lollies and treats on the side and showed his love in ways that were not public, out of fear of persecution, of being called paedophile or whatever. My dad and his dad don't really get along because of that. But the history in the moment isn't rational. So I'm only looking at this from the grandchild's perspective, that the relationship between those two could have never worked out because of the timing in which it was in. Incredibly sad, maybe a great understanding and a tool for healing. But we see this relationship between custom, time period, and expression happen throughout history. How many times have we read in a book that they were friends? We know what that means. They were just friends. The walls blew, the curtains blew. It's the same analogy that we often use. To hide people, there's a shame, I think, that's attached to an expression of the past that has hurt so many people. Truly hurt a lot of people. I was very fortunate to work with the Coroner's Court here in Victoria on understanding LGBTI suicides in Victoria, where 208 lives were lost. Preventable. Often, what was really interesting when we delved into those 208 lives, many were from Asian countries who were here in Australia expressing themselves in ways that they never thought possible. The notion of going back. This is how colonial laws impact us all. We like to think that we're not in it, but we're in it. We like to think that we're detached from it, but we're not. It affects us deeply. So, I was really, really loving going through some case studies across the Pacific in and around where resistance has occurred. So in the Tongan society, Laetus, which I'm probably butchering, has a really complex and interesting understanding of what cultural authenticity means. So for this society, it's a prime example of how resistance movements in the Pacific must contend with the complexities of cultural authenticity and the legacies of colonialism. So TLA advocates for the rights of letters, which are gender diverse individuals who have historically held respected roles in Tongan society. However, the movement also grapples with internal tensions regarding what it means to be authentically Tongan. Because being authentically Tongan isn't to be gay. Being authentically Asian isn't to be gay. Clean the streets, hide the gays. You get the point. In what TLA has done in Tonga has been negotiating between reclaiming pre-colonial identities and also aligning them with this notion of global LGBTIQ+ activism. Some activists in the TLA have argued for a focus on traditional Tongan cultural practices that affirms the role of latias, drawing on pre-colonial understandings of gender and sexuality, and assert that they are an active part of what it means to be Tongan. However, there are some within the movement who push for this alignment to be part of a broader queer rights rather than Tongan rights. Why? Black women, we've got a thing happening. Just shut up for a moment, is essentially what's happening. There are places in which resistance within the resistance is occurring. At a state level in Papua New Guinea and in Fiji, there are Christian doctrines that have become deeply embedded within identities since colonisation. For example, the TLA, another example, seeks to challenge the colonial legacy of legal repression while upholding this notion that in order for us to exist as part of a global queer majority, we can't be Tongan. In order to have our global queer rights, we can't be Tongan. In order to get married, so again, punishment, control, it all shows up. The movement in Tonga is finding a way to reclaim these identities where a context within both colonial and religious legacies are married. What an interesting renegotiation of marriage equality. That you can be non-white and cultured and from a long line of lineage of queer ancestry and still be part of a modern global movement. In Samoa, the Whawhawhine Association understands the politics of visibility very well. They examine resistance within resistance around issues of visibility and representation. So, does anybody understand what Whawhawhine means? It's still word new to you, for most of you. Anyone want to have an attempt to explain what it is? Is there any Samoan people in the room present? So, Whawhawhine are individuals who embody both male and female traits. Often, it's the last male member of a family being born will often be raised as female. So they're socialized fully as female in the community, understanding both their spirits of maleness and femaleness. Yet transphobia exists in Samoa. How does that happen? Where you have such deep cultural recognition of identity within kinship and family, so at the local family level, inside the household, we recognize you as a whawhawhine. As a society, never. Colonial laws have a way of showing up and a legacy that is enduring. that even in the family unit where we have raised you in that way, we can't protect you once you walk outside the door. You know, Josh, I know Eddie's son Josh, and when I was doing my PhD thesis, I was talking to Josh about how he's raising his son and whether that was different from the way that Eddie raised him. And he said, Dad knew that he had to protect me in ways that I didn't have to do with my son. And that was an interesting idea, that for their resistance, generationally, protection looked differently. I hope that in places like Samoa, where we've relaxed in the region, I think our understandings of queerness and transness a little bit might impact a generation in a positive way in a generation or two. That's decolonisation, by the way. Just as a little side note, that we must confront Christian or religious hegemonies that have often redefined cultural authenticity in our communities. Mundine said that Adam and Eve weren't traditionally Aboriginal. Okay, or you know what I mean. This notion that the movement of decolonisation, or in this case, global queer politics, because global queer politics, by the way, is also decolonisation. We just don't think of it in that way because it's a Western movement. How can we resist ourselves in that sense? So, in navigating global queer frameworks, the Whakawhine movement in Samoa faces some real interesting tensions as they advocate for increased participation in international platforms. So, arguing that visibility on the global stage is essential for advancing queer rights in Samoa, others are concerned that this alignment with Western frameworks, particularly queer frameworks, risk erasing the unique cultural context of which whakawhine exists. Their argument is that you can't be whakawhine and a global queer person because the two don't recognise each other. So recognition within the law and then therefore within justice, so complex. But it's not just simple enough for me to just say it in that sense. We have to go deeper and understand why the recognition is not available for us to look at or through. Colonialism, I think, will always be present forever. Bold statement to make. So we're going to be here for the next couple of hundred years anyways, but if we manage to get past this global earth-shattering event that is climate change, perhaps the next big frontier will be really repealing the ways in which colonial legacies have formed and reformed societies, not only in the Pacific, but across the world. When it comes to little simple things like loving thy neighbour, whether thy neighbour be your friend. What's fascinating about the whakawhine experience also is the way that it's become a digital movement. I think apps like TikTok and other social media platforms have really brought to light what it means to exist as an individual in a family unit, in a community, or in a state, in and around the global presence of other individuals. We see that happening right now with Palestinian resistance. We see that happening with LGBTIQ+ resistance. We see it happening on a grander scale, and we're simplifying it down to symbolic gestures of recognition. I'm recognizing that you're looking and feeling the same way that others might be looking and feeling, in a way that expresses that visually or through iconography. But how do you can't drill down further than that. Because otherwise we're all going to be walking around with Wiradjuri flags and Wurundjeri flags and Bunurong flags, and it's just not possible. So we simplify it. But there's a danger, I think, when law becomes simplified in that way. Clean the streets, erase the gays. When people aren't reflected in the laws or in society, they feel like they don't have worth. Every suicide, almost every suicide is preventable. Often people don't see themselves being reflected. And it has to come back to the way in which we've set up our frameworks that apply punishment, control, or order. When we look at this from a drug and alcohol policy perspective, we have shamed an entire group of people. In Australia or in countries across the Pacific, we don't heal, because that means that we've got to look at why it is that we're healing and understand that that shame attached to that healing is a direct relationship to colonialism. And that's just a bigger conversation that I think many in this region, or perhaps across the world, are just too afraid to have. So if I've learned anything really from camps, I've changed it now to churches and colonies, because it just makes sense, is that we have to start to recognise that there are deeply entwined resistance within the resistance, and that's an important focus for us to have when it comes to the what do we do, what's the call to action. I think for me, what I've learned are a number of things, but amplifying Indigenous voices, particularly within the region, is so important. We have communities who are digitizing their land because it's about to be lost. They are moving into a new way of thinking about land ownership and land education for their generations to come, knowing that their land is going to be gone. If only we'd had that technology before 1788. So I think there's a really interesting moment for us to ponder, now that we have some understanding of what it means to resist resistance, to be a legacy within a legacy, and to be a part of a global thing. This is me trying to be gay and queer and modern at the same time. You get it now, right? It's fully there. But I shouldn't have to explain that that's what I'm doing. We should be operating by now at a level in which we have some recognition that people walk through society differently, and that we all play the social game of dressing nicely or doing things that just might make us fit in a little bit more. But that is at the direct assault to the soul who knows that just wants to flare a little flare or do a little better. You know, for many white women years ago, it's the victim dependency, that reminds me of that history. Look at me being dangerous, acting out. It's what it was. We hit the women, not anymore. Little acts of resistance like that, in which change people's perception of their value and worth in society, is so important. Because at some point, when we convince the rest of people that come to Melbourne Law School that we're okay, that we're allowed to participate in society, even in legal definitions and frameworks, we might see that then be applicable in social cohesion, order, and control. But until we reach that point, we're going to have great conversations like this, where I have to point out the differences between Justice Kirby and I. One generation. You get the point. I think when Justice Kirby was my age, there was no way to have this conversation. And that's not his fault. Just like it wasn't my grandfather's fault for not being able to parent. But it's the moments we do now that impact the decisions we'll make about people's lives 7 generations to come. That's what I think is really important. And that, I think, is what I found throughout looking at the challenges in the legal code across the Pacific, cultures that are so deeply ingrained, and their religious relationships that have formed, I think, the intersection between both. That it's not easy, it's not good enough for us just to attack God or to attack the law or to attack the racist uncle. we've got to put it all into context, because the context here matters when it comes to those in the Pacific. That queer Indigenous people aren't just fighting for themselves, but for the broader group. And it sucks when the broader group doesn't fight back with us. That somehow my recognition as a queer Indigenous person wanting to be included is at the expense of your inclusion. We've tried, I think, the way of straight white men for a very long time. America will see a very different shift, I think, if VP Harris gets up. What does that mean for white women? We've jumped a group. Sorry. You'll get there one day. I'm sure you're excellent. It's language I've often heard in my life. So it's good. It's good to see equity play out even now. I guess the takeaway point for me is that despite history being so gay, because it is, it really, I think, like you walk through any colonial painting wall, and there's always two men off squandering somewhere, or two women ploughing a field, or whatever it might be like, and it's present, it's there if we look hard enough. But maybe I'm suggesting we don't actually need to look that hard. We just need to accept that for some people, their queerness, their transness, and their relationship to both has always been, don't hide me, I'm here. Those two figures up in the back of a painting is literally saying to you, I'm here, I'm around, I've always been here. And so I think it's our duty to reject the notion of disappearing, to reject the notion that we can't put people into a mirror to be reflected. Because I think all of us in this room, in some way, somehow have felt what it means to not be reflected. And we can't ever wish that upon our next generation. So the Pacific is gay and very trans, lots of trans people and lots of gender diversity across the Pacific. Go us. But I suspect we'll find that across the world if we go looking hard enough. Thank you.